On April 29, 1992, Los Angeles erupted in violence within hours of a courtroom decision. That afternoon, a jury in Simi Valley acquitted 4 LAPD officers who had been charged with using excessive force in the arrest of Rodney King. The case had been built around a widely circulated video recorded by a bystander showing the officers surrounding King on the ground and striking him repeatedly with batons. The footage had played on television for over a year. Many saw it as clear-cut evidence of police brutality. The not guilty verdict was met with disbelief, then outrage. In south-central Los Angeles, a furious crowd gathered at Florence and Normandy. Outnumbered, police tried to respond but quickly pulled back. As the mob swelled, drivers were yanked from their vehicles. One driver, Reginald Denny, was pulled from the cab of his vehicle and assaulted in full view of a news helicopter. The video of that attack aired live. There was no police intervention. From there, the unrest spread across the city. Over the next 6 days, businesses were looted, buildings were set on fire, and entire commercial corridors were destroyed. In Koreatown, where police presence was minimal, store owners armed themselves and defended their shops from the rooftops. By the time the National Guard arrived, the damage was widespread. When it ended, 63 people were no longer living, more than 2,300 injured, and nearly $1 billion in property had been destroyed. Over 13,000 troops, including National Guard, federal law enforcement, and Marines, had been deployed to bring the city back under control. Many of the businesses destroyed were uninsured. Some communities never fully recovered. In the year 532, the capital of the Byzantine Empire erupted into one of the most destructive riots in history. It started at a chariot race and ended with tens of thousands of lives lost and the city nearly destroyed. At the time, Constantinople was deeply divided. Its people were taxed heavily, frustrated by corruption, and split into 2 massive fan groups, the Blues and Greens, loyal to rival chariot racing teams, but also tied to opposing political and religious sides. Emperor Justinian I's heavy taxes and corrupt officials stoked public fury. After a brawl, 2 rioters, one blue, one green, were sentenced to hang, but the ropes snapped, and they found sanctuary in a church. When Justinian refused to pardon them, the Blues and Greens, usually bitter rivals, did the unthinkable. They joined forces. At the next race on January 13, 532, in the packed Hippodrome Stadium, both factions together turned their voices toward the emperor. The unified crowd chanted a single word, Nika, Nika. Translation, conquer or win. But they weren't cheering the racers. They were challenging the emperor. The chants turned into protests and spilled out of the stadium and into the streets. The protests turned into a riot. For 5 days, mobs rampaged through the capital. They burned entire districts, including the city's most iconic church, the original Hagia Sophia. Government buildings, homes, markets, all torched. Justinian was caught completely off guard and considered leaving the city altogether. But instead, he unleashed the military. Many of the rioters had gathered into the Hippodrome, the very stadium where it all started. With the enormous crowd inside, Justinian's troops sealed the exits. As they entered the arena, chaos erupted. What followed was a slaughter. Soldiers cut down the unarmed civilians trapped inside. It's estimated that over 30,000 people were taken out that day. The riot was over. Much of Constantinople had been destroyed. Homes, marketplaces, churches, monuments. Many of the city's social and political elite were removed or exiled in the days that followed. Justinian held on to power and rebuilt. He even commissioned a new Hagia Sophia, the one that still stands today. On July 23, 1967, at around 3:30 a.m., Detroit police raided an unlicensed after-hours bar in the city's predominantly black Virginia Park neighborhood. 80 people were inside, gathered for a welcome home party for two local Vietnam veterans. The police arrested everyone present. A crowd gathered outside as officers began loading people into paddy wagons. The scene drew attention quickly and tensions rose. Then the first bottle was thrown. By mid-morning, storefront windows had been smashed. Looting began. Police attempted to hold a perimeter, but the unrest spread faster than they could respond. That afternoon, the mayor called in the Michigan State Police. The next day, the governor sent in the National Guard. It wasn't enough. By day 3, fires were breaking out in multiple districts. Snipers were reported. Curfews were imposed. Federal troops were requested to arrive on the 4th day. Over 8,000 soldiers were deployed. Tank units rolled down residential streets. Over the span of 5 days, entire blocks of the city were destroyed. Over 2,500 businesses were looted or burned. Dozens of people lost their lives. Over 7,200 people were arrested, overwhelming the jails. Thousands more were left homeless. The official number of those perished was 43, with over 1,000 injured. The property damage was estimated at $45 million, over $350 million today. On October 31, 1984, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by two of her Sikh bodyguards. The action was carried out in retaliation for Operation Blue Star, a military assault she had ordered months earlier on the Golden Temple, Sikhism's holiest site. Within hours of her passing, violence against Sikh civilians began to spread. In New Delhi, mobs started gathering near Sikh neighborhoods. Sikh-owned homes, businesses, and gurdwaras were marked with signs and then attacked. Many buildings were set on fire. The police often stood by or arrived late. In some cases, they reportedly gave directions or even supplied fuel. Many of the worst attacks were carried out by organized groups. In Delhi, several witnesses identified leaders and members of the ruling party directing mobs, providing lists of Sikh households, and encouraging the destruction. The attacks continued for 3 days. Thousands of Sikh men were assaulted or had their lives taken in the streets. Women were assaulted too. Trains arriving in Delhi were found carrying only the bodies of Sikh passengers. Some families were burned alive inside their homes. The violence wasn't limited to the capital. Similar attacks took place in cities and towns across northern India. Estimates vary, but it's believed that at least 3,000 Sikhs perished, the majority of them in Delhi. There was no declaration of emergency. The military was deployed late. Local police forces in many areas failed to act. Investigations and commissions followed, but few convictions were ever made. The government at the time described the violence as spontaneous. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations suggest otherwise. On April 9, 1948, a single gunshot in downtown Bogota triggered the most violent urban uprising in Colombia's modern history. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a popular presidential candidate and former mayor of Bogota, was shot outside his office in broad daylight. He was a left-leaning liberal with mass working-class support and strong opposition from the country's conservative establishment. At the time of his passing, he was widely considered the frontrunner in the upcoming national election. The shooter was captured immediately by bystanders, but the crowd didn't wait for the courts. They pulled him into the street and assaulted him until he was no longer living. Then they dragged his body through the city. And that's when the rioting began. Within hours, Bogota was overwhelmed. The first targets were government buildings and Conservative Party offices. Streetcars were flipped and burned. Hundreds of shops were looted. Fires spread through the city's business district. Police lost control of entire neighborhoods. Some rioters were armed. Others broke into police stations and seized weapons. The violence spread rapidly. Radio stations were taken over. Civilians began broadcasting calls for revolt. In response, the government deployed the army and police. But coordination broke down. Soldiers fought running battles with crowds, and in some areas, even joined them. The chaos lasted until the next day. Nearly all public transportation in the capital was destroyed. Rail lines were cut. Power grids were damaged. Looting continued for more than 24 hours before the military regained control. In terms of loss of life, the toll was around 2,000, but many estimates place that number far higher. Thousands were injured, arrested, or disappeared. Central Bogota was left in ruins. The Bogotazo was more than just the collapse of public order. The Bogotazo was the beginning of La Violencia, a 10-year period of civil conflict between liberal and conservative factions that would eventually claim over 200,000 lives. It also triggered long-term instability that opened the door to guerrilla movements, paramilitaries, and decades of internal war. On the night of May 31, 1921, a mob of white residents in Tulsa, Oklahoma, gathered outside the county courthouse. They were demanding the release of a 19-year-old black shoeshiner so they could take justice into their own hands. You see, he had been arrested earlier that day after an encounter with a white female elevator operator. What actually happened between them was unclear. No charges were ever filed, but in a city already divided by race and wealth, a rumor was enough. Armed black residents, many of them veterans, arrived at the courthouse, offering to protect the suspect from being taken. A confrontation followed. Shots were fired. Within hours, the streets of Tulsa had turned violent. But the worst destruction came the next morning. On June 1st, just before dawn, white mobs moved into the Greenwood district, a thriving black neighborhood often called Black Wall Street. Armed with rifles, gasoline, and, in some cases, support from local police, they began setting homes and businesses on fire. Witnesses reported private planes flying overhead, dropping incendiaries, and firing into the streets. By noon, Greenwood had been wiped out. Over 35 city blocks were burned. More than 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. Churches, schools, a hospital, and a public library were leveled. Thousands of black residents were left homeless. Some were rounded up and held in makeshift detention centers. The official death toll was recorded at 36, but most modern estimates place the number between 100 and 300 lives lost, with many buried in graves that have only recently been investigated. No insurance claims were paid, no criminal charges were filed. The city, state, and federal government largely ignored the event for decades. On July 7, 2021, former South African President Jacob Zuma turned himself in to begin serving a 15-month sentence for contempt of court. He had refused to testify in an ongoing corruption investigation tied to his time in office. Within days, his arrest sparked protests in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal. Supporters blocked roads, staged demonstrations, and accused the government of targeting Zuma unfairly. But the protests didn't stay political for long. By July 9th, the unrest had escalated into widespread rioting. In Durban and Pietermaritzburg, crowds looted supermarkets, set fire to warehouses, and stormed distribution hubs. Entire shopping malls were emptied. ATMs were ripped from the walls. Factories, clinics, and pharmacies were vandalized or destroyed. Major highways were blocked. Fuel depots were attacked. Trucks were burned on the roadside. In Gauteng province, including Johannesburg, the pattern repeated. Police were outnumbered and under-equipped. In some areas, they withdrew completely. As the violence spread, residents began organizing to defend their neighborhoods. Makeshift roadblocks went up. Armed civilians stood guard in front of homes and businesses, especially in areas where state protection had disappeared entirely. Over the course of a week, 337 people had perished. Some were caught in fires. Others were trampled or lost in crowd surges. Dozens were shot, either by police, business owners, or community patrols. More than 3,000 arrests were made. The economic impact was enormous. At least 200 malls and 1,400 ATMs were damaged or destroyed. Supply chains collapsed, leading to fuel shortages, empty store shelves, and food insecurity in parts of the country. The South African government estimated billions of rand in damage and declared a national state of disaster. In December 1992, Hindu nationalist protesters demolished the Babri Masjid, a 16th-century mosque in the northern Indian city of Ayodhya. They claimed it had been built on the birthplace of the Hindu god Ram. The destruction of the mosque triggered protests and clashes across the country. In Bombay, now Mumbai, the tension began to build immediately. The city was home to large Hindu and Muslim populations living side by side, but also to years of economic strain and rising sectarian rhetoric. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread and small outbreaks of violence were reported across neighborhoods. Then, in January 1993, the situation exploded. Coordinated attacks targeted Muslim homes, shops, and places of worship. Mobs looted and buried properties. Mosques were vandalized. In some areas, Muslim residents were forced to flee. Police responses were inconsistent and, in many cases, actively one-sided. Multiple eyewitnesses and inquiries later found that officers either stood by or joined in the violence. The following weeks saw Muslim groups strike back, burning Hindu homes and businesses in areas like Dongri. Shootings erupted in broad daylight, and parts of Bombay became no-go zones under curfew. Over the course of 2 months, the violence claimed the lives of up to 900 people, the vast majority of them Muslim. Thousands were injured. More than 12,000 properties were damaged or destroyed. Tens of thousands were displaced. On the evening of August 11, 1965, a California Highway Patrol officer pulled over a young black driver named Marquette Fry on suspicion of drunk driving. The stop took place in south-central Los Angeles, in the Watts neighborhood. Fry's brother and mother soon arrived at the scene. A crowd gathered. Witnesses said police used force during the arrest. When Fry's mother was shoved, the crowd responded by throwing objects at the officers. Police withdrew, but by then the situation had escalated beyond control. Looting and vandalism began that night and spread quickly over the next 24 hours. By the second day, the Los Angeles Police Department had lost control of several neighborhoods. Fires were set, stores were looted, crowds confronted officers, and residents described the area as abandoned. The unrest lasted 6 days. Governor Pat Brown mobilized the National Guard, sending nearly 14,000 troops into the city, the largest such deployment since World War II. Armored vehicles rolled through residential streets. Soldiers set up checkpoints and entire blocks were cordoned off. By the time it ended, 34 people had lost their lives. More than 1,000 injured and around 4,000 were arrested. Over 600 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and the cost of the damage was estimated at $40 million, more than $350 million today. In the aftermath, Governor Pat Brown established a state commission to investigate the causes of the unrest. The result was the McCone Commission report, which concluded that Watts had been shaped by poor education, high unemployment, substandard housing, and limited access to medical care. The report stopped short of blaming the LAPD or calling for major policing reforms. Instead, it recommended more public investment, job training programs, and early education incentives. The physical damage in Watts remained visible for decades. Many of the burned-out lots were never rebuilt. On July 13, 1863, less than a week after the Union victory at Gettysburg, rioting broke out in New York City. The immediate cause was the first federal draft in U.S. history, introduced under the Enrollment Act during the Civil War. All male citizens between 20 and 45 were eligible for conscription, but there was an exemption clause. Any man could avoid the draft by paying a $300 commutation fee, an impossible amount for the unwealthy. Tensions in the city had already been rising. Working-class white New Yorkers, especially recent Irish immigrants, were angry about the war, about the economy, and about competition for jobs. They believed they were being sent to fight a war that would end slavery, only to return and compete with freed black laborers for work. On the morning the draft began, a mob attacked the office conducting the lottery. The building was set on fire. Firefighters who tried to put it out were driven back. Within hours, rioters were roaming the streets, targeting city infrastructure, law enforcement, and eventually anyone seen as associated with the draft or the Republican Party. The violence escalated quickly. Telegraph lines were cut, police precincts were attacked, a black orphanage was looted and burned to the ground. As the riots spread, black residents became targets. Dozens were assaulted or worse. Homes and businesses owned by black families were burned. Many fled the city. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. The city's police, hopelessly outnumbered, fell back. The mayor begged for federal troops. Union soldiers, some fresh from Gettysburg, began arriving on July 15th, about 4,000 strong, and charged with bayonets and howitzers to crush the mobs. Martial law was avoided, but the city was loaded with military might. The riots lasted 5 days. By the end, at least 119 people were no longer living. Some estimates go much higher. Thousands were injured. Over 100 buildings were damaged or destroyed, including homes, armories, police stations, and churches. It's still the deadliest civil disturbance in American history. In the aftermath, hundreds were arrested, but only a handful were convicted. The draft resumed under military guard. The city government provided financial assistance to help working-class men pay the exemption fee, effectively formalizing the same inequality that helped trigger the violence. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned something. It really is shocking how quickly things can get out of hand when people are triggered by some sort of injustice or angered to the point of riot. But what do you think? Are any of these justified? Are none of these justified? All of them? What's your take? We'd love to hear from you. And if you liked the video, please give us a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And there should be another video on your screen right now that YouTube thinks you might like, so please check that out. Thanks again. See you next time.